Video games are a multi-billion-dollar industry with hundreds, if not thousands of shareholders and business people behind all of it. The types of people who very likely get paid too much money for the roles that they play when it comes to game development. You know the ones I'm talking about. They're oftentimes old and out of touch with the things that most players would actually want from a gaming experience and focus more so on the bottom line rather than making a great experience for all of us. Despite that fact, did you know that there is one thing we have in common with them? The one thing every single person, more or less, has in common? For the more common folk, it's something as simple as not working up the nerve to tell your local cute barista that you'd like their phone number and you'd like to get to know them a little bit better. By the way, I've never not seen an attractive barista, so if you are one, shoot me an email. For these out-of-touch business people within the games industry though, it's something more along the lines of debating whether or not to invest millions upon millions of dollars into a sequel of a tried and true IP or gamble on a brand new one. At the end of the day, we all have that fear of risk. It's just for us, it doesn't usually cost millions of dollars. In the last video essay a few months ago at this point, I said this. There is something to be said about the lack of new IPs from the biggest publishers in the industry and how creatively bankrupt they seem to be, but that's another conversation for another day. Well, you saw the title of this video. That day is today. And it couldn't be a better day for that conversation. With the season of games showcases well behind us, we now get an even clearer view at the intentions of the biggest publishers and companies when it comes to their futures, where we not only get to see the newest gambles they take, but also the public's immediate reactions to them. All of which only goes to make this video that much more well-informed. And speaking of well-informed, the best way to keep yourself well-informed on everything going on with this channel is by hitting the subscribe button and ringing that bell icon to ensure you get notified. But now, without further ado, I present to you the games industry and the fear of risk. It's no secret that the biggest and highest profile games in recent years have been sequels, whether direct or continuations in long-standing franchises. Allow me to bring you up to speed on them, or rather remind you of them, as I'm sure these past few years may just blur together for a lot of people because of the big global thing I've heard you can't really talk about on here without being suppressed. So let's rewind the clock back a few years, shall we? Some of the major game releases of 2020 include The Last of Us Part 2, Spider-Man Miles Morales, and Doom Eternal, to name a few, followed up by 2021, which saw even more sequels with Resident Evil Village, Psychonauts 2, Forza Horizon 5, Hitman 3, and even a new entry in the Ratchet & Clank franchise. 2022, of course, saw the double whammy tentpole releases of Horizon Forbidden West and God of War Ragnarok, along with the equally fantastic A Plague Tale Requiem, which, if we're being completely honest, is an even better game than God of War Ragnarok. But that's not the conversation we're having today. Feel free to have it in the comments down below though. Do I even need to remind you what sequels came out this year, this first half of the year alone? No? Well, I'm going to anyway. Star Wars Jedi Survivor, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Diablo 4, and Final Fantasy 16 just to cover the first half of the year, and that still isn't even naming all of them. We still have Marvel Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, and a new Super Mario game to round out the second half of the year, should nothing get delayed of course. All of this to say, the current state of the games industry is running on sequels. Just look at the past 3 years alone and it's easy to see that we're living in a generation of sequels. What is the game that you're most excited for right now? I'm willing to bet that it's a sequel, unless of course it's Starfield. What's that one game you hope to see get announced every time there's a video game showcase? You were probably hoping for something like a sequel to Ghost of Tsushima to be announced at the most recent PlayStation showcase. It's not too far-fetched to say that 90% of the time you are hoping to see a sequel announced at these showcases. To be clear, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. When you look at the immediate prequel to those top sequels, you'll very quickly see that those games either outright created or reinvigorated fan bases around them. So naturally, everyone involved would want more from their favorite gaming worlds. The part where it does become a bit of an issue is when the gaming market is nothing but sequels, and where the games industry as a whole becomes rather predictable and potentially becomes a creatively bankrupt market that just turns out more and more of the same. So much so that we often get games that try to piggyback off of each other's success. You have countless amounts of games that essentially mirror other games, often with a small twist. You've got Dying Light 2 and Dead Island 2, both first-person open-world zombie games. I'm sure both games have their dedicated fan bases, but do we really need two first-person open-world zombie games that fill a similar, if not the same void? I mean, hell, in some cases, you get what's practically a new entry in a franchise with just a different name plastered on top, as is the case with the Callisto Protocol and its very clear predecessor, Dead Space. Of course, I know that both games were created by Glenn Schofield, but how can I not bring up the fact that these two shockingly similar games released within 2 months of each other? The concept of this mirror game, as we'll call those coincidentally similar games, goes far beyond just these two examples and expands all throughout the history of gaming. From the mascot platformer craze to the co-op horde shooter, it's just that nowadays, while there are more attempts at it, there are far fewer success stories to come from it all, with many falling to the wayside when others become the more popular of a particular genre. To take a look back at games, it's one of the reasons the mascot platformer sort of withered away, with pretty much only Mario and Sonic maintaining relevance over the years. Sure, some of the others are making comebacks now, but that's only after like 20 years on hiatus. Bring back Banjo-Kazooie, you cowards. A big reason why games like Back 4 Blood have been pushed aside when all people really want is a new Left 4 Dead title, which is precisely what happened to the aforementioned The Callisto Protocol, which only reminded people that what they really wanted was a new Dead Space game. And lucky for them, they sort of got one. Looking at the gaming sphere today, and yes, there are still new IPs coming out, but new IP that people are getting hyped up for is remarkably rare. We can look back at the last season of Games Showcases this summer, and you can very clearly see what games stood out to people most, and the games that were met with a lesser reaction, which is in no way a negative indication of the game's quality or of the work of the studios behind them. For example, on the Xbox side of things, upper management could have gone over to inXile Entertainment and had them work on a new Fallout game. They are a studio with ex-devs from the original Fallout games and have a history with RPGs, so that in theory would be a slam dunk, and would be sure to get a great deal of excitement from the public. But no. Instead, inXile was given the freedom to create a new IP, which looks quite promising, but isn't getting nearly the same amount of attention as a new Fallout game would have. And between you and me, it kind of looks a bit like a mirror game of BioShock Infinite at first blush, heavily inspired at the very least. But seeing as we are 10 years removed from BioShock Infinite, this may be able to fill a void that currently lies vacant. For now at least. And if we want to look on the PlayStation side of things, they could have so easily attached their new Haven studio to a familiar PlayStation first-person shooter IP, such as Resistance, Killzone, or SOCOM, which are all established IPs that now lay dormant and are ripe for a reimagining. But instead, they've also let Haven Studio do their own thing with the new IP Fair Games, which has just about next to no hype behind it. Part of the reason being that a CGI trailer isn't necessarily a lot to go on, but primarily because this game falls under that one risk that all game publishers seem to make sooner or later. One that among players is always met with immediate concern. There's come a time in just about every game publisher's lifespan where they have decided to take a risk. And the only reason anyone takes a risk is for the inevitable associated reward. Let's go back to your local Cube barista. If you were to ask them to hang out, then maybe you'll finally be able to fill that void you've had in your heart since the 7th grade and be able to find some sort of semblance of happiness. A reward more than worth the risk of a moment of being awkward and uncomfortable. If you're the head of a multi-million-dollar publisher, then the reward you'd expect for the risks you take are completely monetary. When it comes to the games industry, there are many risks you could take, whether it be acquiring a number of new studios to bring in-house and dealing with a lengthy court case, creating a brand new IP, or trying to build a game that can boost a company's revenue. For that last point, I'm sure you already know the type of game I'm referring to. In 2018, the games industry changed as we knew it when Fortnite entered the scene and changed the game. While the Battle Royale mode released late the prior year, it was in a pretty bare-bones state at the time. It wasn't until 2018 when things truly began to turn heads with collabs such as Thanos being added to the game during the height of the Marvel fanaticism. From there, Fortnite's success only grew. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single person who hasn't at least heard of Fortnite. Even your grandmother has heard of it. Probably because your cousins are constantly hassling her for V-Bucks, but still. Being the seasonal battle pass always online type of game that Fortnite is, the ability to add numerous microtransactions was abundant and proved to be very profitable for Epic Games. And as a result, it became the exact sort of model that many publishers chase to this day, the live service model. But as I'm certain we all know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Precisely what the games industry continues to do with their myriad of attempts to copy Fortnite's overwhelming success. There are countless games created with this design ethos in mind that have already been lost to time. I wouldn't fault you for forgetting games like Ubisoft's Hyperscape or Roller Champions, both games that tried to make it in the live service space and failed, with the former being shut down completely. And of course, I can't talk about failed live service games without mentioning my personal favorite, and I think criminally underrated and overhated, Marvel's Avengers by Crystal Dynamics. It's easy to hate on the game, but it was always fun to play, which is more than could be said for many other games in this genre. But when a live service game utilizing some of pop culture's biggest, most well-known characters fails, what hope does any other one have? Why? Why do these companies insist on doubling or even tripling down? Why is Sony investing 60% of their budget into live service games when traditional single-player games are what got them to where they are as the games industry market leader? The reward. That reward that just one game that's even half as successful as Fortnite would bring them. Because everyone at one point or another thinks they could create the next big cash cow for themselves. They see creating a live service as the easy way to make money, the quicker way, the consistent way. It's also a lot easier to take a risk when you don't have much to lose. As in many cases, it's not necessarily the development teams who want to make these live service titles, it's far more frequent that they are mandated from those overpaid people we mentioned earlier at the top. Look at it this way. Let's move away from your cute barista example for a moment and try a new one. Imagine you had a button, and every time you pressed said button, you'd get $1 million, but there's a 50% chance you'd die instead of getting the money. Pretty risky, not really a button you'd be rushing to press. Now imagine that same button, but instead there's a 90% chance some random person across the globe dies when you press it. Suddenly, that button becomes a lot more enticing to the majority of people, since they themselves are no longer at direct risk of death, even though a random faceless person is. You may even start to rationalize your choice by saying random people die every day. What's one more? Which is precisely the same kind of logic that those businessmen at the top use, and why they are more than willing to mandate certain always online aspects or scummy and predatory business practices in the games they just so happen to oversee. Any blowback won't fall entirely on them, and financially they won't even feel a thing. The dev studio, though, would. All because those sleazy suits at the top get paid far too much, considering all they do is treat their employees poorly and be misogynistic. They just want to make money the easiest way possible, despite risking the studios below them. But just because you take that risk, that doesn't necessarily guarantee you the reward. You can't forget about your cute barista who could just as easily shoot you down. But because the reward of a successful live service is so great, it's the one risk publishers are so willing to take. I don't think it's too insane to say that in the past 5 years, the games market has become more about chasing the money rather than innovating the industry, which is exactly where the insanity of risk stems from. I know it would be easy to blame Fortnite for that shift in focus, but as the industry grows, the AAA games only become more and more expensive to create, with player expectations higher now than ever. Publishers are always going to try to find new ways to increase their income, and more importantly to them, their profits. We can never forget how much EA used to pump their games full of microtransactions, an early attempt to pump some extra funds into the company, but now with a very successful live service game like Apex Legends, there have been no more microtransactions that I'm aware of plaguing the rest of their games. There is no one to blame for this shift in the games industry. It was always going to go this way. Fortnite was just the first game to crack the code. It was inevitable. In the past, the games market was an entirely different landscape. There was a time when people were far more open-minded to all kinds of games, but through the advances in technology and the frequent one-upping nature of the industry, things sort of spiraled out to an almost unsustainable level. What I mean to say is that back in the earlier days of gaming, things were more varied, where game devs were still trying to carve out their own identities in the games they created. The industry was a lot more carefree, with no sign of these AAA games taking the industry by storm and putting the idea in some devs and publishers that those AAA titles were an ideal to strive towards. Today, however, is a different story. Today, there are AAA studios popping up everywhere, and today's landscape is one where all these studios are making a homogenized version of what is seen as the industry standard for a AAA game, and they all tend to follow whichever trends are hottest at the time. In the past 15 or so years, countless games have all adopted a handful of the same things. Open worlds, likely popularized from the early Ubisoft titles that were successes, RPG elements, likely due to the incredible success of the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, and ultra-realistic graphics over the use of heavily stylized graphics, which could be attributed to any number of AAA games for bringing that one to the light, just to name a few of these trends. They are all things that over time have become seen as things your games need to be put on a higher pedestal than all the other games releasing around it. If you were to think about a game right now, any game at all released in the past 10 years, 9 times out of 10 it's going to have at least one of those features in it. It's become commonplace in the industry at this point. Which isn't to say that there aren't some devs out there who don't chase these trends. There are, of course, a handful of AAA studios who do their own thing, and hundreds upon hundreds of indie devs that don't get the proper recognition, and who are arguably making efforts to push the industry forward. It's more so the third-party development studios trying to create a smash hit for their publishers where this trend chasing is most apparent. Why, you may be asking? Because games cost a lot of money to make. Considering how relatively young the industry is, it is just the cost of innovation, and with some of their competition releasing these phenomenal 10 out of 10 games that evolve the industry, it would be much easier to look at what was working so well for those games and put some of those teachings into their own games, than to take a risk of your own and figure out something new. It is also because of these 10 out of 10 genre-defining games that a lot of player expectations have been skyrocketing in recent years. People ask, why can't every game be as amazing as Breath of the Wild? Then we end up with games like Immortals Phoenix Rising, trying its hardest to be even half as good as what is essentially its source material. And by the way, in the process of editing, apparently there was a sequel planned that was cancelled, so that's a little awkward to talk about now, but anyways, let's just keep on moving. Oh, you guys really liked Assassin's Creed Origins? Well, guess what? Odyssey will have 3 times as much content, then Valhalla has 4 times as much content on top of that. It's the doubling down on something that works without really stopping to figure out why it clicked so well with people in the first place. Just hoping people will continue to buy the next entry because it's like this other one, but with more content. At some point, there's just too much. As soon as one game becomes a hit, it's very common where you see the sequel take a lot of those same elements and simply build upon them. As the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This in turn makes these sequels easier to develop in certain aspects, such as time to market, and with the increase in time and budgets to these massive games, it all starts to make a bit more sense. Today, the games industry generates around 5 times as much revenue as the film industry, effectively making it one of, if not the highest grossing market in the entertainment industry as a whole. with the budgets of AAA games matching those of your modern-day summer blockbuster. The biggest difference between film production and game development is the time to market. While your typical blockbuster can take around 2 years when considering principal photography all the way to VFX production, the average AAA game takes on average 5 years of development. In many cases, even longer than that, making game development as a whole more of a risk because of the time cost over the return on investment. The last generation of consoles was more of a time of exploration for many of the development studios. It was in the last 10 or so years when these breakout franchises started, with games like Horizon Zero Dawn making its debut and God of War's reboot sending the franchise to an even higher pedestal. Both of those games sold tremendously well, with both games selling over 20 million copies to date, which is exactly why we got sequels to them and not a sequel to a game like Days Gone, which did not meet the sales expectations of Sony at the time. With such massive budgets and extensive development times, sequels are a far safer bet, as statistics only go to show that these highly anticipated sequels not only generate more hype, but will always sell better than their predecessors. In the eyes of the executives at the top, having that established fanbase to guarantee a minimum amount of sales only helps to push forward on the sequels. So that's it then. We're just doomed to get nothing but unoriginal sequels, reboots, and games that copy each other for the rest of time. It's curtains for the game industry. Toss your consoles in the trash and pick up a book instead. No, put that book down. Of course, this doesn't mean it's the end of the games industry. Just as you aren't going to die alone, just ask out that cute barista already. Once you get over that fear of risk, then you can begin to grow. The Naughty Dogs and Sony Santa Monicas of the world aren't always going to be what we see them as today. There will come a time when those teams within them change. God of War 2018 game director Cory Barlog could leave the industry someday. Hell, we just saw Evan Wells, the now former co-president of Naughty Dog, retire from the company, leaving The Last of Us co-creator Neil Druckmann in his place, who will also someday leave the industry. Beyond just PlayStation, Bethesda's own Todd Howard, game director on some of my personal favorites such as Skyrim or Fallout 4, and hopefully soon to be Starfield, has gone on record to say that the next Elder Scrolls may very well be his last. The game development studios as we know them won't last forever. Being such household names in the industry though, they will always have a few tricks up their sleeves, I'm sure. This is in no way to say that they aren't risk takers. I mean, that's exactly how they got to where they are in the first place after all. For all intents and purposes, the games industry is still very young. To compare this to the movie industry, we just got Color Picture a few years ago. As such, a lot of these founding members of the industry will eventually make way for the next generation of the games industry. But who are they? Where will they come from? Remember earlier, I said that there are hundreds upon hundreds of indie devs who don't get the proper recognition, who are arguably making efforts to push the industry forward. Yep, it's them. Most of, if not all of, the next generation of the auteurs, if you will, you know, your household names like Neil Druckmann and Hideo Kojima, they will likely come out of these smaller indie studios who are taking bigger swings and bigger risks. For many of them, there will come a day when they release a breakout hit, the type that goes beyond being seen as just an indie game. The studios behind these games then get some eyes on them from the bigger companies who are more willing to spend a bit of money on a smaller studio and help them reach their full potential. For example, take a look at Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which, believe it or not, Ninja Theory was an independent studio when they released it. Since then, they've been acquired by one of those bigger companies, Microsoft. And with that acquisition, Ninja Theory was given a number of resources they didn't have when they were an independent studio, namely a bigger budget. Which all goes into making Hellblade's sequel, Senua's Saga, a game that is seen as a full-on AAA title rather than a sequel to an indie game. Of course, that's only one example, which also is a sequel, but as we all know, they aren't the only small indie studio Microsoft has acquired in recent years. To bring this whole thing full circle, inXile Entertainment has never really been a mainstream name in the games industry, but now, under the Xbox Game Studios banner, with more resources at their disposal, they are now poised to become one with the release of their newly announced Clockwork Revolution. Whenever a studio comes out with a hit, then that studio itself brings along with it a fanbase of their very own. While The Last of Us or Metal Gear Solid may be what Neil Druckmann and Hideo Kojima are known for, the people, the fans, they've gained from their previous works will be eagerly awaiting their next project, whatever it may be, a sequel especially, but they'll always show up for a new IP from their favorite creators. I mean, hey, just look at the hype that's surrounding Starfield if you don't believe me. That didn't come from nowhere. It came from the years of fantastic games like Oblivion and Fallout 3 to get there. The same can start for inXile and for any dev studio at any moment. For every Todd Howard, there are hundreds of people who are inspired by his work to create games. People from all walks of life. As the games become more and more inclusive, more diverse people attach themselves to them, and in turn give us new games with perspectives and insights we have yet to see. It is these inspired few who will be able to look at the games that they loved and truly understand what made them work. And they won't just emulate the biggest trends, they will innovate on them with new ideas and the use of new technologies. And maybe, just maybe, one of them will become one of these next auteurs. So no, of course the games industry may be stuck in a bit of a rut right now, but it's only temporary. While the games industry may have a fear of risk, there are still those on the ground floor with more bravery than those at the top, and it's because of them, the indie studios who are taking these risks, that the games industry will not only survive, but will thrive far off into the future. I would like to say thank you. Thank you for clicking on this video. Thank you for reaching the end of this video, and definitely thank you for your patience while I was making this one. This one is something I'm especially proud of, and I hope that was able to shine through during the video itself. As such, it would mean the world to me if you were to share this video everywhere you can and engage with it in every way that you can. Not only would I appreciate this video performing well, but I also think that it has a message that more people need to hear. The people who are worried about the future of the games industry, and the people who have noticed the subtle stagnation in the industry. I hope my words, my video, will bring them some peace of mind. I can't wait to bring you more content of this caliber of quality. And thanks again for everything. Now get out of here. And as always, stay safe and play some video games.